Winter hung heavily over the city, with cold winds sweeping through the narrow streets, brushing away the thin layer of snow that covered the asphalt. Claire adjusted the heater in her luxury car as she navigated through the congested avenues. Traffic was slower than usual, which annoyed her, but it wasn't enough to distract her from the business meeting she was heading to. She took a deep breath, observing the streets around her. To Claire, the chaos of the city was just background noise to her ambitions. People were struggling to survive while she steadily rose, focused relentlessly on her career. She firmly believed that anyone could succeed as long as they worked hard enough. As she stopped at yet another red light, something caught her attention. A thin, poorly dressed woman stood next to the car, holding the hands of two small children. The children's clothes were worn and clearly inadequate for the biting cold. The woman, her face marked by despair, held a makeshift sign asking for help. Claire averted her gaze. "Another one begging for money," she muttered to herself. However, the woman, determined, approached the car window and tapped lightly on the glass. Claire let out a long sigh and, against her instincts, rolled down the window just enough to hear. "Please, ma'am," the woman said, her voice trembling. "My kids are hungry and it's so cold. I just need a little help today." Claire, cold and direct, looked at the woman with a steady gaze. "Help?" Her voice was sharp. "You need a job, not charity. Go find work." The woman's eyes, which had been filled with hope, brimmed with tears. I've tried, but I can't." Claire cut her off, her impatience barely concealed. "We all have problems. You need to do something about it. Begging for money on the street won't solve anything." The woman, visibly crushed, tried to speak again, but Claire had already rolled up the window, ending the conversation. In her rearview mirror, she saw the woman walk away, pulling the children along. Claire hardened her heart even more. If she wanted to change her life, she'd do something about it, she thought, stepping on the gas as the light turned green. Claire's eyes returned to the road ahead, once again immersed in her thoughts about the upcoming meeting. This was how she dealt with the world around her, compartmentalizing, ignoring. For her, there was no room for failure or weakness. That morning, Robert was also heading in the same direction, on his way to a meeting that he and Claire would attend together. Driving calmly, he was used to observing the streets with a more attentive eye. Unlike Claire, he cared about what he saw around him. As he approached a traffic light, a scene caught his attention. A woman, dressed in worn-out clothes, stood on the sidewalk with two small children. They were shivering from the cold, and the woman seemed lost, trying to protect her children from the biting wind. Robert saw the desperate look in her eyes and knew in his heart that something was wrong. The woman, whom he soon identified as Emily, approached the car, clearly seeking help. Robert rolled down the window, noticing the tired and worn face of the mother. "Sir, please," Emily began, her voice weak. "We have nowhere to go. My children are hungry, and it's so cold." Robert looked at the children beside her, their pale faces, small arms holding tightly onto their mother. He felt a pang in his chest. "How long have you been out here?" he asked gently. Emily bit her lip, trying to hold back tears. "Since yesterday, I've been trying to get something, anything, but no one listens." Robert nodded, feeling the weight of the situation. He had always believed in hard work, but he also understood the importance of compassion. "This isn't right," he murmured to himself. Then, looking directly at Emily, he said, "Get in the car. I'll take you to my house. You need a warm place and a meal." Emily hesitated for a moment, surprised by the unexpected offer. "Are you serious?" Robert smiled kindly. "Yes, I am. I can't leave you like this. Come with me." Without thinking twice, Emily opened the back door and helped her children inside. Her eyes still filled with uncertainty, but with a glimmer of hope. Robert checked his watch. He knew he had an important meeting, but at that moment, it didn't seem so urgent. He picked up his phone and called his secretary. "I'll need to cancel my meeting," he said calmly. "Something more important has come up." When they arrived at Robert's house, he immediately provided blankets and something warm for Emily and the children to eat. Emily, still in shock from his kindness, thanked him repeatedly. I don't even know how to thank you," she said, as she settled her children on the sofa with the blankets. "You don't need to thank me," Robert replied with a smile, already calling someone from the kitchen to prepare a hot meal for the three of them. "Just rest for now." The house was comfortable and warm, a stark contrast to the cold that had surrounded them outside. Although Emily was still worried about the future, she felt a deep relief as she saw her children finally warm and fed. Robert sat at the table watching them, his heart heavy as he thought about how many other families like this one went unnoticed. Moments later, the front door swung open forcefully, and Claire entered. She was tense, clearly frustrated by the traffic and the meeting she had earlier. As she entered the room, her gaze immediately fell on Emily and the children, and her expression changed to a mix of shock and anger. "What is this?" Claire demanded, her voice filled with disbelief. Robert stood up calmly. "This is Emily," he said without hesitation. "She and her kids will be staying with us for a while." "Staying here?" Claire repeated, incredulous. "You've got to be kidding me. This is crazy, Dad. I saw this woman begging for money this morning. She needs a job, not charity." Robert didn't flinch. "She needs help, Claire, and I'm going to offer what I can." Claire glared at Emily, who remained silent, holding her children's hands. "You can't do this," Claire said, her voice rising. "She's not our responsibility." Robert met her gaze firmly. "She may not be your responsibility, but she is mine." The tension in the air was palpable. Claire huffed in disbelief, and without another word, she turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. Claire stormed up the stairs, her anger growing with each step. The cold outside still stung her skin, but it was nothing compared to the fury she felt seeing that woman, Emily, sitting on her father's sofa, as if she belonged there. By the time she reached the top floor, she was breathing heavily, her thoughts swirling with indignation. Meanwhile, Robert remained calm, seated at the dining room table. He knew Claire wouldn't accept his decision easily, but he also knew he had to stand firm. Claire returned a few minutes later, her expression even more intense. "Dad," she began, her voice controlled but cold, "I don't know what you're thinking, but bringing a stranger, a woman begging on the street, into the house? This is insane." Robert looked at his daughter with patience, waiting for her to calm down before responding. "Claire, this isn't the first time I've done something like this. I've always helped those in need, and that's not going to change now. She's not our responsibility," Claire insisted, her hands trembling slightly. "She's just one of thousands that you can't help. It's dangerous, reckless." Emily, who had remained silent until now, lowered her head, feeling the weight of Claire's words. She had grown used to being ignored, or worse, treated like a nuisance. But here, in this house, she had hoped she might find a bit of peace. Now, she felt more out of place than ever. Robert, however, didn't back down. He slowly stood and walked over to where Claire was. "You're right," he began, his voice low but firm. "I can't help everyone, but I can help this family, and you can too if you want." Claire scoffed, crossing her arms. "Do you really think this is going to fix anything? How long is she going to stay here? How long are you going to keep supporting this situation?" "She'll stay as long as it takes," Robert replied without hesitation. "What else can she do right now? And who's going to help her if not us?" Claire's posture stiffened even more. "She hasn't done anything for herself, Dad. If she was really trying, she wouldn't be out on the street with 2 kids. I saw her today. I heard her story, and I don't believe her." The harsh words cut through the air like blades, and Emily felt every one of them like a blow. The children, now asleep beside her, were blissfully unaware of the tension in the room. But Emily, her eyes still on the floor, didn't know what to do with her hands. She wanted to disappear. Robert, however, stood firm. He knew Claire was projecting her own fears and frustrations onto the situation, but he wasn't going to let that change his principles. "You talk about effort, Claire, but you know so little about what it really means to fight for survival," Robert said, his voice sterner than before. "I've been there. I know that road. The difference is, when I was starting out, I had opportunities. What if no one had given me a chance? Claire narrowed her eyes but didn't respond. She knew her father's story, knew how he had come from nothing to build his fortune, but she couldn't reconcile that with the reality she saw now. To her, Robert's success was proof that anything was possible if you worked hard enough. "You had courage and vision, Dad," Claire said, trying to keep her tone steady. "You didn't give up, but she glanced disdainfully at Emily. "She's taking advantage of you." Robert slowly shook his head. "Do you think this woman, with her kids, is here by choice? That she wants to live like this?" He took a step toward his daughter, his face more serious than ever. "You have a strong heart, Claire, but you need to learn how to use it differently." Claire blinked, surprised by her father's stern tone. It disarmed her for a moment, but she quickly composed herself. "This is a mistake," she said, her voice less confident than before. "And when it goes wrong, don't expect me to fix it." Without waiting for a response, Claire turned and stormed back up the stairs to the guest room where she stayed when visiting her father. The sound of her heavy footsteps echoed through the house, followed by the sharp slam of the door. Robert stood still for a moment, staring at the empty stairs. Then he let out a long sigh and returned to the sofa, where Emily remained seated, trying to make herself invisible. He knelt beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry about Claire," he said with a gentle smile. "She'll understand. She just needs time." Emily nodded, though her hands still trembled slightly. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice breaking with gratitude and exhaustion. Robert stayed there for a few more seconds, then stood up. "Rest. Tomorrow, we'll see what we can do to really help you." Emily looked at her children, now sound asleep on the comfortable sofa, and for the first time in days, she felt a small spark of hope. The following days were strangely quiet in Robert's house. Claire kept her distance, avoiding long interactions with her father or Emily. She spent most of her time in her room, busy with work or lost in her thoughts. The presence of Emily and the children bothered her deeply, but out of respect for her father, she decided not to confront him again, at least for the time being. Robert, on the other hand, stayed busy making sure Emily and her children were as comfortable as possible. He had arranged rooms for them to sleep in with more privacy and provided warm clothes and food. Even so, the tension in the air was palpable, especially when Claire was around. One cold morning, while Robert was in the kitchen making coffee, he felt a sharp pain in his chest. It was sudden, but enough to make him pause and lean against the counter. He took a deep breath, thinking the sensation would pass. But seconds later, the pain returned with more intensity. His face lost color, and before he could call for help, he collapsed to the floor, the sound of his fall echoing through the house. Emily, who was in the living room with the children, heard the noise and immediately ran to see what had happened. When she reached the kitchen, her heart raced as she saw Robert lying on the floor, unresponsive. Without thinking twice, she rushed to his side, kneeling beside him. "Robert!" she screamed, trying to wake him up, but he didn't respond. Her years of nursing training, though dormant, kicked in instinctively. She quickly checked his pulse and breathing. Weak, but present. Emily didn't waste any time. She pulled Robert into the recovery position and began administering the first aid she knew so well. Her heart pounded with fear, but her hands moved with precision and calm. As she worked to stabilize him, she shouted for help. "Claire! Claire! Come quick!" Claire, who was upstairs, heard the desperate call and ran to the kitchen, the sound of Emily's voice filling her with dread. When she arrived, she stood frozen for a second, seeing her father on the floor and Emily crouched beside him, trying to keep him conscious. "What happened?" Claire asked, the panic clear in her voice. "He collapsed," Emily replied quickly, not taking her eyes off Robert. "Call an ambulance, now!" Still in shock, Claire grabbed her phone with trembling hands and dialed emergency services. Her voice barely managed to explain the situation, but the paramedics promised to arrive as quickly as possible. While they waited, Claire silently watched the way Emily handled the situation. There was an impressive competence in her movements, a calmness that contrasted with the chaos of the moment. Claire had never seen her father so vulnerable, and the fear of losing him tightened her chest. But at the same time, something inside her began to shift as she watched Emily, whom she had despised so much, fighting to save Robert's life. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. Emily continued to monitor Robert's breathing, keeping his head elevated, speaking softly to him in hopes of keeping him conscious. Finally, the sound of the ambulance siren approaching brought a tense relief to the house. The paramedics quickly entered and took control of the situation, placing Robert on a stretcher and rushing him to the hospital. Emily stepped back, taking a deep breath for the first time since everything began. Claire remained silent, her gaze distant, still trying to process what had just happened. Later at the hospital, Claire sat in one of the chairs in the waiting room, arms crossed and her mind spinning with what she had just witnessed. Her father was stable, but the doctors said he would need a few days of observation. The shadow of death that had loomed over him still terrified her deeply. Emily, sitting beside her, looked equally exhausted but serene. Claire couldn't help but glance in her direction. No matter how hard she tried to hold on to her belief that Emily wasn't trustworthy, she couldn't deny what she had seen. If it weren't for her, Robert might not be there. "Thank you," Claire finally murmured, breaking the silence between them. Emily looked up, surprised by the unexpected gratitude. "I just did what I had to do," she replied, her voice low and humble. Claire stared at the floor, unable to meet her gaze. A weight of guilt began to settle in her chest. "I was harsh with you," she admitted, her voice softer than usual. Emily didn't respond immediately. Instead, she simply nodded, as if to say she understood. After all, she had been through moments where she had unfairly judged others as well. In that moment, the two women, so different in their paths, were united by what truly mattered: Robert's well-being. The hospital was quiet, except for the soft hum of monitoring equipment and the distant sound of footsteps in the hallways. Claire sat in the waiting room, her thoughts racing non-stop. Her father was resting in a nearby room, recovering after the emergency. The doctors had said he would be fine, but the scare still reverberated inside her. She had never imagined seeing Robert so vulnerable. Her father had always been the pillar of strength in her life, an unshakable man. But now, seeing him like this, Claire realized something she had been ignoring for a long time. He wasn't invincible. She wasn't invincible. That reality shook her to her core. Emily sat beside her in silence. She also looked exhausted, but there was a calmness in her posture that intrigued Claire. Something about the way Emily had reacted during the crisis stirred a growing discomfort within her. Maybe it was the fact that, without Emily, her father might not have survived. Or maybe it was simply that Claire was beginning to see Emily as more than just a beggar. There was more to her story. Claire knew that now, and it was impossible to ignore. Finally, after a long silence, Claire broke the ice. "You knew exactly what to do with my dad," she began, her voice low but firm. "How did you know?" Emily looked at Claire, her eyes tired but without hostility. There was only sincerity there. "I'm a nurse," she said calmly. "Or, at least I was." Claire blinked, surprised. "A nurse? But what happened? How did you end up in this situation?" Emily sighed, nervously fidgeting with her hands before continuing. "I was a nurse, yes. I worked at a hospital here in the city, long shifts, but I loved what I did. Things changed when my husband died." Claire stayed silent, listening closely. It was the first time Emily had spoken about herself without fear or desperation in her voice. "He died in a car accident 2 years ago," Emily continued, her voice faltering slightly. "And that's when my life fell apart. The pain of losing someone I loved so much was just the beginning. Without him, the bills started piling up. The worst part was that he worked for a mid-sized company, and I trusted that even without him, we'd have some security, but things got complicated." Claire frowned. "Complicated how?" "After he died, they told me there was an error in the paperwork and that he wasn't entitled to the insurance we were counting on. I had to leave the hospital to care for the kids full time, and when I tried to go back, my job wasn't there anymore. For a moment, silence fell heavily between them. Claire leaned back in her chair, feeling a wave of discomfort as she processed what she'd just heard. Emily's story was tragic, but alarmingly familiar. Claire knew how cruel the system could be, how bureaucratic decisions could ruin lives. But what disturbed her most was something else, something she couldn't quite put into words yet. "Where did your husband work?" Claire asked, suddenly curious. Emily hesitated for a second before answering. "He worked for Taylor Industries, a subsidiary of a larger company. Your family's company." The shock hit Claire like a slap. She felt her heart tighten and her mouth go dry. "What?" The words escaped before she could stop them. Emily nodded, but there was no accusation in her voice, only a deep weariness. "Yes, he was laid off during a crisis, along with many others. He spent months without a job before landing that last one. And then the accident happened." Claire's world seemed to tilt for a moment. Her family, her company, the organization she had helped build had, in some way, played a direct role in the downfall of Emily's life. The weight of that realization hit her with unexpected force. Claire had always believed that her success and decisions were separate from the lives of the people she barely knew. But now, as she looked at Emily, she could no longer deny the truth. Her company, her choices, had consequences. "I didn't know," Claire murmured, guilt creeping into her voice. "I had no idea." Emily looked at Claire, her expression more sad than accusatory. "I know you didn't know. Most people never do. Most. They don't see what happens to those left behind. I don't even blame you directly for it. But when you saw me on that street, I just wanted you to know it's not always a lack of effort. Sometimes life falls apart, and there's nothing we can do to stop it." Those words hit Claire hard. For the first time, she saw something beyond her own perspective. This woman sitting next to her wasn't just a failure, someone who hadn't tried hard enough. She was a person who had tried, who had fought, but had been knocked down by a combination of personal tragedy and an unforgiving system. Claire sighed deeply, feeling emotionally drained. "I was unfair to you," she admitted, her voice filled with regret. "I think I was blind. I always thought it all came down to hard work, but maybe I was wrong. I didn't know my father, that our company had such a big impact on your life." Emily gave her a sad smile. "I don't expect you to fix everything, Claire, but now that you know, you can do things differently." Claire nodded slowly, Emily's words echoing in her mind. There, in that hospital room, she was finally beginning to see that the world wasn't as simple as she had imagined. And for the first time in a long while, she felt the need to do something to make things right. The cold wind blew through the hospital windows as Claire sat motionless, trying to process everything she had just learned. The silence between her and Emily was heavy, but not uncomfortable. The revelations of their last conversation continued to echo in Claire's mind. The woman she had despised and treated coldly was, in fact, someone deeply affected by decisions for which Claire was, in some way, responsible. After a few minutes of silence, Claire shifted in her chair, trying to find the right words to say. She felt compelled to do something concrete, something that could in some way correct the mistakes of the past. "Emily," she began hesitantly, "I need to do something to help you. After everything you've been through, I think I can at least try to make up for what happened to you and your family." Emily looked at Claire, her tired eyes curious. "What do you mean?" Claire took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. "I know money won't erase what happened. It won't bring your husband back or fix everything you and your kids have gone through. But I can offer you an amount of money, something that can help you get back on your feet, give you some stability again." Emily was silent for a few seconds, as if pondering Claire's words. She wasn't surprised by the offer. It was the kind of thing she expected from someone like Claire, someone who saw money as the solution to most problems. But to Emily, life had already shown her that money alone wasn't enough to fix the deepest wounds. "I appreciate it, Claire," Emily responded calmly, "but I can't accept it." Claire looked at her, confused, clearly not expecting that response. "You can't accept it? Emily, I know it's not the solution to everything, but it can help you get out of this situation. It can give you and your kids a better future." Emily shook her head, still with that sad smile on her lips. "I understand the intention, and I know you're trying to do what you think is right, but what I really want isn't your money." Claire furrowed her brow, unable to fully grasp what Emily was saying. "Then what do you want? What can I do to help?" Emily straightened up and looked directly at Claire with a determination that surprised her. "I want to do something bigger. It's not just about me and my kids. There are so many people out there in the same situation as us. Entire families who are invisible to society, just like I was to you that day in traffic." Claire felt the weight of Emily's words. She was beginning to understand that this situation wasn't an isolated case. Emily wanted more than a temporary fix. She wanted to change the system that allowed so many people to fall through the cracks. "So, what do you have in mind?" Claire asked, genuinely curious now. "I want to create a community shelter," Emily said without hesitation. "A place where homeless people can find shelter, yes, but also where they can start over, offering more than just a bed and a meal. I want to create opportunities, training, guidance, real support so they can rebuild their lives, just like I'm trying to do." Claire sat in silence, absorbing what Emily had just said. A community shelter. It was an ambitious idea, something that would require time, resources, and a clear vision. But there was something in Emily's voice, something in the way she spoke with such conviction, that made Claire see the depth of it. Emily didn't want charity, she wanted to create change. "It's an incredible idea," Claire admitted, crossing her arms as she thought. "But this will need much more than good intentions. It's going to need money, structure, support." Emily smiled slightly. "I know, and that's why I'm asking for your help." Claire blinked, surprised by the twist. "My help? You have the resources. You have the knowledge. And more importantly, now you understand that these people need more than just compassion or temporary charity. They need opportunities, a real chance to get back on their feet." For a moment, Claire stood still, reflecting on everything that was being said. She had never considered this kind of initiative before. In her mind, the world was made up of winners and losers, and people should simply fight for their positions. But there, sitting in the hospital next to Emily, she began to realize that not everyone had the same opportunities to fight. "Do you really think this can work?" Claire asked, still uncertain. "I believe it can," Emily responded firmly, "and I believe that together we can make it work." Claire took a deep breath, still processing the magnitude of what was being proposed. She had always been someone who acted pragmatically, and her initial instinct had been to solve everything with money. But now, for the first time, she was being challenged to think differently. This wasn't about charity, it was about creating something meaningful. Finally, Claire nodded. "Okay," she said, determined. "Let's do it. I'll help you create this shelter." Emily smiled, this time with genuine gratitude. For the first time, it felt like her voice, her ideas were being heard. And so, a plan began to take shape. A plan that would not only change Emily's life, but also the lives of so many other invisible people in the city. And perhaps it would change Claire too.